Hello everyone, I'm Max Louis, and for the last 2 or 3 years, I've been writing books about psychiatry based upon my own very unpleasant experiences with that supposed branch of healing as a patient. And my writing is very unconventional, very irreverent, and it began with poetry because poetry is seems the best way to express raw emotion and emotional suffering, the sort I was going through, and also because a poem is shorter than a longer prose piece generally, and because of what they had done to me, my mind was in such a bad state for years and years and years that it was very, very hard for me to really think about conveying my thoughts in a longer, more coherent, and even mannered kind of article approach. Um, but I was eventually able to, using kind of my high school, you know, into English literature training, to come up with a book of quite a fairly long book of poems, which explore the issue from many different perspectives, and fortunately able to convey something of my deep, deep suffering as a result of my involuntary treatment. Um, so my first book was released in 2018, and it's called Madness: A Form of Love, because I think it's important to portray this topic in a slightly more lovely and beautiful light, um, so that people like me who are subject to the offices of psychiatry don't don't feel so degraded, put upon as they are, and instead, we turn that around and do the exact opposite as a form of therapy, um, and breathe dignity, you know, into into the people this happens to, and also the notions themselves, because the way you describe something, as Jordan Peterson says, the way you describe something, where you look at it, makes a big difference to how it affects you and the way it manifests. As strong uh, as Stefan Molyneux says, you know, um, your expectations of somebody are almost always what they become. So if you put a very, very negative label on someone, this is basic labeling theory in psychology. If you put a very negative label on something, or if you put a very negative label even on a concept, um, then it tends to conform to that very low initial um, estimate of its worth and potential and outcome. Um, so, if you put a very negative label on a young child, they're likely to conform to it, unfortunately. If you say that blue-eyed children, are much better at maths, they will do much better at maths. There are studies showing that. And you say somebody is mentally ill and they have a very serious mental illness, unfortunately, especially when they're young and they haven't developed their own strong sense of identity, they will tend to conform to that very low estimate. their potential. They may be, they may it may cause them to despair, so that they feel that they can't achieve more than you set for them. It acts as kind of like a signal of despair. Um, um, but then if you do the same to a concept, if you try and see the positives in a certain idea, for instance, take socialism or capitalism. You can see these things positively or negatively beyond the basic concept itself by painting them one way or the other, and that's what political propagandists do. And that certainly shapes how people see them, and to a certain extent the way it affects them and the outcomes that people have with it. I mean, obviously, if you paint a concept, like say capitalism, in a very, very negative light, well, that is going to lead to people having outcomes with it. At least they're not, in the sense that they're not going to be impressed by capitalism. They're going to turn away from it. And they're going to embrace some other ideology. So that's one simple way in which it affects outcomes. But it's deeper and more. It goes beyond that, because I mean, for instance, if you talk about how lovely a piece of food is and all its health benefits, well, what you will get is you'll get people actually enjoying the food more and experiencing those benefits, because, well, this is one manifestation of the placebo effect, if you like to put it like that. Um, so the expectations that people have surrounding anything are very significant in determining the after outcome. And madness is a form of love. Well, you see, there are many positive things about mental patients, or the so-called illnesses that they are said to suffer from. As I explained in my other videos, I mean, at a very basic level, human unhappiness and dysfunction is caused precisely by an absence of love, and in itself is a cry for love. So in that sense alone, a very deep, central sense, madness is a form of love. In that sense, it's a cry for love. And a cry for love is itself a form of love. If one is being humane about it. Because you see, all these so-called illnesses, what they do to the person who's awake and has eyes to see, they presence in the Heideggerian sense. They presence the human need for connection and for genuine love. And that is an immensely powerful thing. Um, so, all poets know, again, that something, you can make something beautiful by the way you talk about it, right? All poets, this is what poets do. Um, and if we can begin to see the positive aspects, if we can see mental illness as a form of longing, right? Love is longing, and longing is love. And the harder, and the more painful the longing, the more admirable or beautiful it is in many respects. That's why, for centuries or thousands of years, it's been the tragedies which have which have struck people as most beautiful, and in many ways most romantic. And the most, in a way, the most beautiful form of love, the most fit for the screen, is unrequited love. And that's what mental health patients, that's really what they have. That's really what they are. They are unrequited love. Um, they have a longing and a need which is not being satisfied by society, certainly not being satisfied by the doctors. So that's one of the meanings, to my book, to my title, "Madness: A Form of Love." Um, so that's one aspect, and there's also, apart from that, there's also divine madness, which is another thing I explore in my writings, and that's an even higher type of madness, if you like. It's not just humanly, poignant. It's actually divinely inspired, because although this is quite a uh, it's somewhat defunct idea nowadays, even in many apparently very religious communities, or if it exists in religious communities, it doesn't cross over to the wider culture in the way you might expect. And that is the idea that God actually exists, and He doesn't just exist as some kind of like you know belief, to be argued and debated over, like Richard Dawkins would. Um, and for either mindless belief or rational critique, etc. or reasoned belief even. You know, this kind of way of approaching it is one way, but there's another way, which is simply that people have direct experience of God, and he's an undeniable guiding presence, in their life, just as undeniably as, you know, this is a check shirt that I'm wearing. Um, so these religious experiences, whether you have experienced them or not, they almost certainly do exist. And um, many people do believe that nowadays, and they have experienced it themselves. I would think. But like I say, as in terms of the world culture as a whole, it doesn't really cross over into mainstream culture very much, this idea. And most egregious of all, you know, are people on psychiatric wings called schizophrenics, who this is sometimes what they claim. And their claims are essentially dismissed, prejudice, without an inquiry that they may even possibly be correct. And this is a glaring contradiction to the fact that many people in religious communities, you know, this is exactly what they believe, and sometimes they believe it even without evidence. So they're not actually experiencing themselves, but they still believe in God, and they base their whole lives around it. So this seems far madder, in many respects. Um, but also, I mean, basically, if you look at what religion says, and it kind of, it kind of demands these beliefs being possible. If you look at the Bible, there's no doubt that God sends messages to human beings in the Bible. And there are, literally billions of people who believe this or claim to believe it. And on top of that, there are quite a number of people in those religious communities, who also claim to be guided by God, right? And and yet, if somebody goes into a psychiatrist's office and says this, they will summarily, without an inquiry, be labeled schizophrenic and have their freedom taken away. Um, so, my actual work, um, in fact, you know, discusses the notion of divine madness, which it's a very, venerable, time-honored concept, and it has to do with, you know, um, direct divine experience or guidance, right? Um, and why is it called madness? Well, it's called madness because it's super rational. It it's it short circuits the rational processes of the human mind, and it appears, more as, I know this, but I don't know why, or I have a strong, signal to do this, and I can tell by my experience that this is the kind of thing I would call God. It seems to be always correct. So, this is kind of a kind of madness in that it is it's a kind of knowledge beyond the merely human or the rational. The socially recognized. You know, co- cold-headed. Sorry. You know. Well, common sense prudence or whatever you'd like to call it. For instance, somebody may. There are examples. There are examples of person with a brain tumor. They don't know they have a brain tumor, but for some strange reason, they just feel a desire. They're kind of like they feel a desire to walk down the road somewhere. They walk down the road. They take a bus to somewhere. They feel the need, the desire. They feel that call to take a bus to somewhere, and they end up outside, some kind of like hospital or something. Um, and then they just they have a strong urge to go and see the doctor, right? Um, that isn't. I didn't describe that in the most poetic way, that could be described, or amazing way. But these sorts of things happen where a person is, guided to do something that um, that actually turns out to be extremely important, in a way that they could not understand. So this is the sort of thing I was talking about, and there are lots of examples, that you hear about of this thing happening. I've come across quite a number, and I don't go particularly go out of my way looking for them. So this defies rational explanation, or it appears to defy rational explanation, or it appears not to emerge from the normal functioning of the human ego of the person who receives this kind of guidance, but instead it appears to that person as some kind of higher guidance. And we can clearly see this is, without stretching words too much, would generally be considered almost a form of madness. So this is one kind of divine madness, right? um, um, and obviously if it exists it's very important. you know um, uh, but I mean, clearly this is another way which we can clearly celebrate or beautify madness or seeming irrationality. So that's part of what my writing is about. And just to expand a little bit on that, you see Nietzsche saying, that nothing good came to Greece, except through madness. Or actually, Plato said that. Plato said nothing came good. Everything that came good that came to Greece came through madness. Nietzsche says, you know, in ancient times, in olden times, you know, if you had some new idea or anything or wanted to, influence society in a inspirational way, you had to appear to be mad. You had to either be mad or appear to be mad. Um, so we see a very venerable lineage for this idea. If you want to get into that, um, um, so obviously, if the religious view of the world is true, like say Christianity is true, it would be absolutely vital, could not be more important to rehabilitate this notion of divine madness and how it might be manifesting in mental asylums all over the world. Um, I mean, and if one really is a Christian, one should essentially, one is demanded to mainstream it and try and save as many souls as possible by reconnecting them to God, to be guided by God. Um, but that's just a possibility, a bit far out. But many people would claim that we are in end times now. So that's one possible relevance of my writing, if it persuades you at all. Um, I will say very clearly that one cannot be a Christian, right? One cannot be a Christian and believe in schizophrenia. Well, or at least one cannot be Christian and be pleased with what goes on in mental asylums and the way doctors diagnose people. If you are a Christian, you are obliged to care for God's people, for your fellow servants of God, and that does not include endorsing the systematic labeling, degradation, captivity, and drugging of people who claim simply to get to be guided by God, to have divine revelations, be to be guided by divine assistance directly. You're a terrible Christian if that is what you're doing. Uh, of course, you don't have the power to change it necessarily, and you may also argue that some of these people could be demon possessed. But the basic uh, conceptual contradiction between psychiatry and Christianity is absolutely undeniable, and you cannot but be concerned, for what is being done to these people who are simply claiming divine guidance. it needn't be said that a Christian is required to take responsibility, not for his own, just for his own salvation, but to try and ensure the safety and salvation of his fellow human beings around the world and defend those who are being persecuted. So I'm essentially ordering you to take much more of an interest in the rights of those who are labeled schizophrenic, and to recognize the basic logical structure of the situation and how it relates to your own beliefs and approach. If you're a Christian and you claim you're being guided by God, and you go to a psychiatrist who isn't a Christian in the wrong area, you will be labeled as schizophrenic and you have your freedom taken away from you. The logical structure is exactly the same. Many of the people who are schizophrenics, they are Christians. They do claim to be Christians. It's just a matter of chance, or randomness, or being in the wrong area with the wrong people that will get you labeled as schizophrenic. If you're part of a strong Christian community, your doctors will probably back you up, and they won't be like to do that kind of thing because they're Christians too, and it's just all part of the same community. If you come from a more kind of diverse community, so diverse isn't the word I was looking for, but I mean a more fractured community, which is not so predominantly Christian, and you don't come from a Christian family yourself, and you say that Jesus is guiding me to do such, to think such and such things and do such and such things, even when they're fairly harmless. This is a religious delusion, according to psychiatrists, and because the person is more isolated, the system will swallow them. So, what determines whether somebody is or is not in danger of psychiatric captivity is not how sane they are and how reasonable they are. It's much more to do with how isolated they are and how much that community is broken down. But did Jesus say that Did Jesus say that, there are no Christians uh, who are lonely? Did Jesus say there are no Christians who are lonely and, you know, aren't particularly good at fraternizing with others? Or did he say, you know, uh, you have to, turn away from your own parents, turn away from your whole society, and follow him alone, you know? Well, he said pretty much the latter. Uh, anyway, um, so if you're watching me for the first time, hopefully you'll see that I'm very passionate about the subject and I've got a lot of things to say about it. And I've also written two other books. Well, three other books, not really. It's a trilogy. A Gaslit by a Madman. The trilogy Gaslit by a Madman. And I'll explain what gaslight means. It means to make somebody feel crazy, to to kind of deprive them of their their sense of reality, and make them fall into excessive doubt. It's generally ascribed, in general culture, to the idea of, let's say some kind of so-called narcissist. It may be slightly aggressive or uh, um, or abusive, man often, who is said to, gaslight his so-called victims, you know, um, his girlfriend, for instance, right? Um, or, within a family, you have, a so-called narcissist, maybe the father, who is keeping his children unnecessarily nervous and unsure of themselves, by, gaslighting them, as it said. Or it can be more extreme, and could have a husband gaslighting his wife in that he actually tries to convince her that she is crazy, makes her feel crazy, with the intention of getting her locked away in a mental asylum. And obviously, all of these three cases, happen a lot, and you can read about them. Quite common. And but then there's also professional gaslighting, which is the profession of psychiatry, which its whole reason detect, according to me, or in reality, is to gaslight patients in the sense of labeling them ill when they're not, and making them more ill by labeling them ill until they become a bit deranged in order to subjugate them and make a living from their patienthood. Um, so that's what gaslight means and how it refers to me and my writing. Um, but then, as I've said in my other videos, I also adopt the term, ironically, in a more positive sense, to my attitude towards my audience. Because to make somebody question their sense of reality is not necessarily an aggressive, pathological, way of mistreating them, but it's also a kind of definition for what real philosophy is. Real philosophy and real philosophers do question their own sense of reality, and they also question the reality of a society or of their listeners. So, in that sense, in keeping with the beginning of this video where I talk about seeing the positive in things, we can also see the positive in gaslighting, understand? Um, this is very important that we don't start sectioning you know or stoning our philosophers to death for questioning our reality and questioning our cherished pieties and beliefs, which is not some highly abstract possibility, but it's the norm throughout history, and it's a very other real danger inside of human nature. So on the one hand, we have abusive boyfriends who are so-called gaslighting their girlfriends. Maybe this can be a bit nasty and detrimental. But on the other hand, we probably have some girlfriends who are accusing their boyfriends of gaslighting them because they're trying to, open up their worldview a little bit. That's probably a bit rare, but there are other more common examples, where we do get this phenomenon where somebody will be questioning and trying to open up somebody's worldview or trying to debate with them or argue with them, And if we go too much in the other direction, what we'll have is that, oh, this person is just, a thought criminal. They're hate speech, and they're trying to gaslight me. They're a narcissist. For and they're trying to impose their belief upon me. So there are dangers in both directions. And in fact, it's often more dangerous. The bigger danger, is the majority of people becoming angry at those who try to get them to question for the individuals, the rare individuals who try to criticize society and get society and other individuals to question their own, sense of reality, their own sense of right and wrong. So my book, covers both aspects. And the important thing is trying to reach, happy medium. And my books, my Gaslit by a Madman trilogy could hardly be more flamboyant. One critic refers to my work as fucking child collages. And they didn't mean that positively. So if you look into my books, I combine in Chinese terms the demotic with the Mandarin style. I very much combine the demotic or vulgar popular style, or even subpopular, crass, with the highbrow, ideas which I'm trying to actually deal with, and thinkers as well. So the style is very much a mongrel style, a multicultural style. Sorry, I shouldn't say mongrel and multicultural in the same breath, because I actually do believe in multiculturalism, and the word mongrel is not too flattering, is it? Generally, but I'm a mongrel myself, though. Okay. Um, so essentially, I come waving daggers at society in these books, because although I'm actually a very civilized and gentle person, I wouldn't condone violence against, even doctors. I believe in, in actually calling a spade, and when there is an injustice at stake, to speak about it in very strong moral terms. The emotional effect should in some way be proportional to the injustice one is talking about. So it's not really acceptable, or certainly not preferable, to talk about in a highly dry, scholarly, neutral, respectful way about something which is where great human suffering is at stake. No matter how widespread or conventional the practice is, which you believe causes that human suffering. So the level of civility or respectfulness is not relative to how conventional or widely accepted something is. It's always relative, or should be relative, to the amount of human suffering involved and at stake. And I see an absolutely enormous amount of human agony at stake in the issue of psychiatry, literally millions of people being tortured worldwide every year. Um, so I approach it in much stronger terms than is considered decent. Um, generally in society. And on top of that, partly because I was out of my mind because of what psychiatrists did to me, and partly because I think it is an intriguing and fertile way to approach these things, I actually adopt, what I call a mad aesthetic. So I take on the road of the fool, right? And that explains the strange, you know, cartoons or whatever you see in my writings, in my books. Which isn't so which is very normal nowadays anyway, because that's what all memes are anyway. So in one way, I'm drawing too much attention to myself, making too much of a fuss about my unconventional style anyway. But it does seem it probably is quite unconventional for books which I don't know, philosophy books, books which claim to be by serious philosophers. Um, I mean, essentially, I see what I'm doing as what Nietzsche or John Locke would be doing if they were alive nowadays. Even though what I'm doing is, on the face of it, 1,000 times more childish and vulgar. But in my own worldview, I think this is what Nietzsche or David Hume would be doing nowadays, because a philosopher basically fits his message to the time. He changes with the time, fits his message to the time, and also a real philosopher does not put much store on the distinction between low and high culture. The real philosopher does not aspire to fit in with the dry scholarly manuals. He never has. So for those who do have who look down upon silly child scribbles and think that they can't be serious philosophy, that just shows how unphilosophical your outlook really is, and how you don't understand the way the great philosophers actually thought. Just to clear that up. Um, uh, um, so check out my books on Amazon if you would, and know that the Gaslit by a Madman trilogy contains a huge amount of visual art and also basically memes just cobbled together and stolen from the internet. So there's a lot of stuff in there which isn't my own work, and I don't know if I have to take it down due to copyright or something, I'll have to. I'm perfectly happy to do that. I don't know, but as as soon these memes are freely available on the internet, and I just stuff them into my Kindle, some of them. But there's obviously a huge amount which is my own work. Um, but I'm not too particular where my ideas come from or stuff comes from. The important thing to me is that it's true and it has a positive influence. So if people want my book for nothing, for free, and I can't charge for it because it's got a lot of memes, borrowed from around the internet in this Kindle. Well, I don't know. I would happily give it to them for free. Um, um, so, I mean, just quickly, in my very recently released book, it's like literally about 600 700 page book, which is really in many ways a defining statement of the last 12 13 years of my life. And it's a very quite good and also novel and with a lot of flair and deep, very philosophical critique of psychiatry in general. Rather than approaching it from a formal scientific approach, there is some science in there. This is a very artistic and philosophical Nietzschean, appraiser of psychiatry, obviously from a very personal point of view. But there's probably nothing like it out there, and it throws a great new perspective on the subject and on society in general. And for that reason, I highly recommend it. And I think you can get more from it and get something deeper from it than you get from almost any other um, literature on psychiatry on the market. But also a very interesting perspective on philosophy and society in general. Thank you. Wish you all healing.